Mr. Gregory, if you are suggesting to me that there was some form of conspiracy amongst my people to dupe me, I refuse to believe that.
I could have done something then. I wish I had.
You were duty bound to.
I was duty bound to.
You were supposed to act with integrity.
Yes.
With honesty.
Yes.
You were supposed to give full and frank advice.
Yes.
You breached the code of conduct by your deliberate choice. Well, would you describe the Robodebt scheme implemented under your secretaryship as a massive failure of public administration?
I consider it was a failure of public administration.
On a massive scale?
On a massive scale, on a significant scale.
Can you think of a larger scale failure?
Well, you're not taking the Royal Commission seriously? I just don't understand this.
In this video, I want to summarise the evidence from Week 2 of the Royal Commission into Robodebt. If you haven't watched my summary of Week 1, I'll link to that in the description. And that has a lot more background, as well as who the main players are at the Royal Commission itself. These hearings are all public and available to stream on the Commission's website, but Week 2 has 34 hours of footage. I wanted to summarise the key takeaways so that you can stay informed, and, as always, I want you to hear the evidence for yourself, and I'll provide some comments for context along the way. So let's get started. This is Week 2. The first day focused on evidence from the departments themselves, the Department of Social Services, or DSS, and the Department of Human Services, or DHS. Each department nominated a representative to give evidence on its behalf. The two departments sound very similar, and it can get confusing. You just need to remember that DHS was actually running Robodebt through Centrelink, and DSS was involved with the policy at a higher level. The first witness was Matthew Flavel, who is representing the Department of Social Services, or DSS.
Your full name is Matthew James Flavel, and your current position is a Deputy Secretary within the Department of Social Services?
That's correct.
And particularly in Social Security?
That's right.
How long have you held that position?
I came into that position on the 9th of November 2020.
It's important to note that some of these witnesses weren't around when Robodebt was being developed and implemented, so all they can do is go off information they've been able to find from internal searches, from things like emails and documents. That being said, I got the impression that this witness wasn't very prepared, although it may be that the department had done incomplete searches for relevant documents. That didn't stop the Commission from grilling him though.
One of the requirements to provide a statement was to refer to documents already produced to the Royal Commission by their document identification number. Your statement doesn't refer to relevant documents already provided to the Royal Commission by their document identification number, which was a requirement of the request for a statement. Are you able to identify why that was not done?
Sorry, I'm not able to identify now.
Did you discuss that requirement of the notice with the solicitor who assisted you to provide your statement?
To be honest, I don't think it came up during the discussions I had in the preparation of my statement.
Is there any...
See, it's not very helpful because you make assertions about a state of affairs, but you give no supporting documentation, so there's no way of the Commission looking at what you were looking at to see why you say things. Was that not obvious to you as you prepared this, that you would make an assertion, for example, that the department obtained internal policy and legal advice concerning the proposed use of income averaging, but provide no document reference at all, so one can only guess why you say it?
I understand the point you're making. I was provided with assistance in preparing it, and that issue about the provision of the supporting documents did not come up in the preparation of my statement. I have, however, looked at all of the documents that were used in the construction of that statement.
Well, that's great for you, but we're never going to know what they were. I find it really hard to understand how you could think that this would be useful, to ask us basically to take your word, that's what the documents say about various points, without giving the Commission any opportunity to look for itself.
You may have recalled, Mr Flavel, that in the letter 20 October 2022, Exhibit 837A, specific attention was drawn to this in the paragraph that said, in addition, we note that in the response, Mr Flavel indicates that he has reviewed various materials to inform himself about the matters to which he is responding. In most cases, the response does not make clear what that material is, nor does it indicate whether the material will be produced to the Royal Commission. For the avoidance of doubt, the Royal Commission requires Mr Flavel, pursuant to the notice, to produce those materials subject to any relevant privileges and/or immunities. Do you recall that in the letter?
I recall that, yes.
What happened after that letter in terms of a response by you?
I don't think I provided an additional response after that.
Were you not taking the Royal Commission seriously? I just don't understand this.
No, I don't want to give that impression, Commissioner. I was taking it very seriously. It's just the actual process. I had been led to believe that those documents would have been provided in support of my statement. I take the point that they may not, in amongst a very large number of documents, been specifically identified.
You might remember that DSS had internal legal advice back in 2014 that said that Robodebt would be unlawful. The real mystery is what happened with that advice.
You say departments prepare new policy proposals all the time for the benefit of its citizens, but the advice within DSS was that it would not potentially fit the legislative requirements, and the policy advice was that it wouldn't be for the benefit of the social security recipients. What did DSS do with that information in respect of sharing it with DHS?
I understand there were emails. The point I'm trying to draw out is that at that point it's not a new policy proposal, it's simply a policy proposal that's being worked on at that point actually by fairly junior officials across both departments.
Yes, what did DSS do with its policy and legal advice in respect of the DHS proposal?
Well, I don't know, because to know that I would need to know what actually went into the Cabinet submission at the point at which the new policy proposal to give effect to this scheme actually took place.
What did DSS do insofar as its relationship with DHS in respect of the legal and policy advice?
Well, as I recall, that there was sharing of that information, and that the then Deputy Secretary Serena Wilson made contact with Malisa Golightly, who was at that point the Deputy CEO, to either discuss or raise the concerns that DSS had.
And what record do we have of those communications?
There's an email to that effect.
To what effect?
To that DSS had concerns at that level with what was being proposed.
And what was the response from DHS?
I've not seen a response. I've not seen a response other than I recall that Ms Golightly said, thanks, we'll discuss further or consider further. There wasn't a specific response that went to the heart of the proposal.
That's a very vague answer. And because his statement has no document references, it's hard to locate the emails he's talking about. Safe to say that not much happened with the 2014 advice. A proposal for Robodebt was still prepared.
What may be surprising is that when DSS got specific advice which was against the proposal, it still went ahead. On your review of the documents, was the DSS advice, policy and legal, disregarded by DHS?
Well, when you say it went ahead, you have to know what was actually in front of the Cabinet at the time to know that that proposal went ahead.
No, there is a February 2015 brief to a minister, so we know what went ahead.
I think
And that's what I'm getting at.
that 2015 minute, I think, is the one to Mr Morrison.
Yes.
And what that did was simply establish that a proposal should be developed for consideration by ERC.
Yes, but the point is that process proceeded, that is, an executive minute to the relevant minister was developed, irrespective of the policy advice and legal advice that was communicated by DSS to DHS. And I'm trying to understand how that happens. Did DHS disregard the advice?
My recollection from that minute is that it did refer to the fact that there may need to be legislative change. I'm saying that I've not seen anything that suggests that there was particular advice given from senior levels of DSS at the time the decisions taken in late March relating to the risks attached to the proposal.
Why not? Wouldn't it have been obvious, given its earlier advice and its understanding of what DHS proposed?
Yeah, it is a mystery.
Did it appear to you as though the advice from December 2014 was just shelved because it conflicted with the will of the government?
I'm sorry to harp on it, but unless I know what actually went to Cabinet and it was exactly the same as what was being proposed in 2014, it's difficult to...
Yes, well, you're here giving evidence as the proper officer. You hold yourself out as that and you've conducted an extensive review of documents. My question's related to the conduct of DSS, not the ministers, and why DSS didn't do something with the advice that it obtained when it was obvious that the proposal required, or DHS was going to implement income averaging. What did DSS do with it? The advice?
I've not found anything that suggests that was raised at the time that the decisions were taken in March of 2015.
In another part of his evidence, the witness says that at some point, DSS changed their mind and started to think that Robodebt was in fact lawful, despite having legal advice saying the opposite. It looks like they changed their mind after a presentation was given to them by DHS showing the online system. It's very odd.
There was reference to a meeting at Tuggeranong Office Park in early 2017.
And did that meeting include the provision of legal advice by DSS or review of the 2014 legal advice?
I hazard to say, I'm just assuming, but assuming it was a presentation of the way in which the online compliance intervention worked, and that DSS officers felt satisfied. Indeed, in around April 2017, be aware that Mr Finn Pratt, the then Secretary, wrote a letter to the Ombudsman with words to the effect that the department is satisfied that it's operating consistent with legislative provisions.
And where have you identified the source or what documents are relied on for that position?
There's a reference to a briefing for estimates hearings in the early part of 2017 that reference that fact.
And in the preparation of the briefings for that purpose, have you identified legal advice?
Have I identified? No legal advice.
Right. So the satisfaction occurred irrespective of any material change that you've identified from the legal advice of 2014?
It presumably involved officials of DSS satisfying themselves that the way in which the measure was being implemented was consistent with the legislation.
Presumably, but it appears they did so without any legal advice.
I'm just not sure what you mean by getting separate legal advice, or just...
There was a legal advice from Ms Pulford in 2014. And was that revisited, to your knowledge?
In 2017, I don't recall it being revisited in the files I've seen, obviously.
So what you're saying is departmental officials shifted from dissatisfaction in respect of compliance with legislative requirements to satisfaction in compliance with legislative requirements because of a presentation by DHS.
Well, it would appear there is some way of doing that because Mr Pratt has written a letter to the Ombudsman, which is a public letter, saying that it's consistent with legislative provisions.
Yes, that's what I'm getting at. The basis of...
Those are questions best put to Mr Pratt, I think.
Right.
We will hear evidence from Pratt later in the video. There was also questioning in relation to draft external legal advice received from the law firm Clayton Utz. You might remember from week 1 that DSS received a draft advice that confirmed Robodebt was unlawful, but they ignored it and never got the law firm to finalise the advice.
You refer to an advice by Clayton Utz, 14 August 2018. Do you recall reviewing that document?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. What investigations did you make in respect of what happened to that document once it was received by DSS?
I don't recall seeing what happened to it other than I recall some reference that it was going to be discussed at senior levels. I don't recall any emails that went to the taking of action, simply the receipt of the advice.
Did you ask for specific searches to be conducted in respect of what happened to that advice?
Not specific to that advice. It would have just been, as I've covered earlier, in terms of the various search criteria that we used.
This was obviously sufficiently significant to identify it as a standalone advice in your statement. Surely what happened with it was of equal significance?
As I said, I don't recall seeing anything in terms of what actually happened with the advice itself.
I understand that, but my question was, surely you would agree that what happened with the advice was of equal significance to the advice?
Absolutely, and I'm saying I didn't find any documents that went to that point.
This is an occasion where the trail just goes cold again after the receipt of a significant legal advice. What possible explanation could there be from a departmental perspective about why nothing seemed to happen with that advice after it was received?
I don't know.
Have you made any inquiries?
Not specific to that point, no.
Can you identify any reason why it wouldn't have been shared with DHS?
No, I can't.
Section 10.8 of the Legal Services Directions of 2005, which are, 2016, I think, 17, I think they were amended, was in force at this particular point, which obliged DSS to share the advice because it related to a matter of significance to a government program that was carried out by DHS. Particularly where there's a legislative imperative to share that advice, can you identify why that legislative imperative would have been ignored?
I can't.
It seems to be a significant shortcoming in terms of the treatment of unfavourable advice within DSS.
It does.
Much of the evidence from DSS was along these lines. A lot of unknowns about why things did or didn't happen. Let's move on to the evidence from DHS, which is the department responsible for Centrelink.
Yes, Mr. Gregory?
Thank you, Commissioner. Your name is Christopher Birrer,
Yes, it is.
and you are employed by Services Australia.
I am.
In what capacity?
I'm a Deputy Chief Executive Officer, currently heading up the agency's Royal Commission response team.
And how long have you been employed in the department known as Services Australia?
I transferred to Services Australia from the Department of Defence in August 2020.
You were not present in the department, that is employed in the department at the time that the Robodebt scheme was planned, designed and implemented?
No, but I have been there during the refunds and then the settlement distribution scheme processes.
Right.
This witness was a lot more prepared and seemed to have good knowledge of what had actually happened at the relevant times.
In a narrative form then, the Robodebt scheme really commenced following the budget proposal, that is the budget measure in 2015-2016 and the announcement.
That's true in a technical sense, Mr. Gregory, but I think what's also important is the preparatory work, and particularly the work in developing the concepts that informed the proposal that went forward as well.
And are you referring there to the work of those within the Department of Human Services, including a Mr. Britton and a Mr. Ryman?
Yes, I am, yes. The Department of Human Services, and in particular the Business Integrity Division, developed the initial concepts and did the planning for the Robodebt scheme, and then led the work to seek government approval to implement the Robodebt scheme.
He made reference to some people involved in developing Robodebt in the early stages, Mr. Britton and Mr. Ryman. They will give evidence later in the video. Then there was some evidence given about what was happening pre-Robodebt.
Yes, pre-Robodebt, it was the highest risk cases that were prioritised for review.
And the assessment or review process in respect of those higher risk cases was undertaken manually, that is by compliance officers?
Yes.
And it involved initially, as the 2004 protocol suggested, a review of its own file, in addition to the review of information from third parties such as the ATO, including the detailed TFN category of information under the Act.
Yes.
And that's why it took time and energy to achieve a review.
It did, and also as part of that, the third party, it could involve issuing notices to employers to provide information, or other third sources. So yes.
And pre-Robodebt, the power to issue notices to employers was exercised routinely by Centrelink compliance officers?
Yes.
And that's because the PAYG information was not the best source of information, to put it neutrally, for the purpose of the manual review.
Yeah, well, there could be at least two aspects to that. One is whether, like the PAYG information, whether or not the employer had reported the dates of employment in a way which sort of reflected what the actual recipient's employment was, and then secondly, to find out or to be able to obtain from employers like fortnightly rates of pay, particularly for people with variable income throughout the financial year.
Yes. Mr. Birrer, the reviews in the pre-Robodebt period undertaken manually by compliance officers were conducted according to various standards that had been established within the department?
Yes, there was staff guidance around the process, yes.
One of the documents which has been given the label operational blueprints, are you familiar with that?
I am, yes.
And that's one of those documents that gives compliance officers guidance about the way in which they conduct a review, particularly in respect of what is sufficient evidence to raise a debt.
Yes.
Now, this section of the blueprint suggests that if every possible means of obtaining the actual income information has been attempted, it's possible to use evidence available to raise a debt, including an annual figure. But it thereafter identifies a series of obvious difficulties with using annual figures, and they work in both directions. The first is that it might not be possible to obtain evidence of an overpayment if you annualise a figure in circumstances where indeed even there might have been underreporting.
Yes.
And the same applies conversely for overreporting.
Yes.
And in many cases, income might vary greatly during the year and the result may be incorrect because of the averaging process.
Yes.
So basically, before Robodebt, it was clear to the government that income averaging had clear limitations when being used to raise debts. Evidence was also heard about the testing of the online system before it was massively scaled up. This online system was a massive failure when it first rolled out and added to much of the stress and confusion recipients were facing.
In the testing phase, there was, in essence, an inadequate testing process to identify what might occur, inadequate in the sense of the numbers and inadequate in sense of the duration and inadequate in sense of the capacity to scale up.
It seems to me that the Department of Human Services sort of rushed to failure in rolling out the OCI process and system rather than looking to stabilise it and build a more mature system.
It really became the pressure on the public service, that is the department, to deliver the expectations it had created in the executive minute, which compounded the difficulties in that short space of time when it was expected to have the system up and running.
It did, Mr. Gregor, and I think the failings in the effective project management of the implementation of the online compliance initiative was an important factor in that. And in saying that, I'm setting aside the issue of the unlawfulness of averaging, but even if it was lawful, that the mismanagement of and poor management of that project and that scaling up activity. And I think, and one thing that comes through from discussions with people who were involved at the program at the time is that there was quite frequently quite sort of a very demanding and difficult leadership environment with lots of workplace tensions and aggressive and demanding leadership that was sort of helping to shape the work environment in what I would regard as a very mildly an unhelpful way, but also at times from people's recounting of stories to me in an inappropriate way. And I presume at some point witnesses will speak to their first-hand experiences about that.
This hostile environment is something that we will come back to. The next day of evidence went back to the people who were directly involved. The next two witnesses worked at DHS and were very close to the development and rollout of Robodebt. You might remember this.
And are you referring there to the work of those within the Department of Human Services, including a Mr. Britton and a Mr. Ryman?
Yes, I am, yes.
We'll hear from them now, starting with Scott Britton.
Do you swear by Almighty God that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you.
Just in terms of your period of employment at the Department of Human Services relevant to this inquiry, am I right in understanding that you were the National Manager for the Compliance and Risk Branch Participation, Aged Care and Integrity Group of that department between 11 January 2010 and 28 November 2016? I'm taking that from paragraph 9 of your statement.
Yes, that's correct, yes.
This witness gave evidence that Robodebt was born from two main factors: government expectation for savings, and the fact that the manual process in place before Robodebt could only ever review a small proportion of potential overpayment cases. The majority of cases flagged were never reviewed because there just wasn't enough staff. Many of these reviews wouldn't result in a debt, but there was still some discrepancy that could be investigated.
And from what you're saying, it was the issue that there were large amounts of potential non-compliance which the department didn't have the capacity to investigate.
That's correct, yes.
And am I understanding your evidence correctly that you felt under increased pressure to find ways to somehow investigate those potential non-compliances?
I think, yes, I did. And I'd say yes, we did. I think there was a general expectation at that time around recognising the environment and the context by which I provide around the pressures, the inability to complete work, the large stockpiles of work. There was certainly an expectation around looking at ways by which we could treat that volume of work.
And am I right that if those potential non-compliances could be investigated and actual non-compliances identified, that was potentially a very significant body of funds that could be recovered to the Commonwealth?
That's correct, yes.
And hence why it achieved some significance in relation to budget measures.
Yes, I'd agree with that statement, yes.
And am I understanding your evidence that it was not uncommon when the budget was under consideration for your branch to be looked to identify means of increasing compliance activities to increase savings for the Commonwealth?
Yes.
For the purpose of the budget?
Yes.
Okay.
So what was this witness's involvement?
I didn't have visibility of every decision, every critical element, and I could say that comfortably on reflection and having gone through the emails made available, but I was part of the conversation. I was certainly part of many of the discussions as far as the early thinking around, the measures, the concepts.
And thereafter, what level of personal oversight did you exercise over the development of the program?
2015.
2015, yes.
So I think specifically, I recall that period. I recall that. So I've referred to within my statement that the department at the time had quite mature project management expectations and processes. So certainly as part of the early development, I was definitely and most likely regularly in conversation with Jason and his team, but predominantly Jason around the development of those pilots. I recall documents referring to, the early design and testing concepts as well. Sort of then transition through that period, that next 12 months. So we had at the time and throughout the development of that ICT, there was a specific branch and division responsible for business integrity technology. We had regular meetings with that group, both formal and many informal. I know that as we pushed hard into delivery timeframes, on reflection, the challenges were immense. And I think that, again, that's reflected within some of the documentation I've referred to within my statement, where this was a fast-paced building new technology, developing new thinking. There was a lot of structure around those conversations. I remember personally having to travel to Adelaide very frequently to meet with ICT colleagues in the build of what would become the OCI system, given the technical nature of that.
And really early on, there were red flags.
Yes. Please find attached the most recent pilot plan. We can go to the next email up in the chain. This is from Owen Lang, who we discussed earlier.
Yes.
Dated 6th of May 2015, addressed to Jason and others, and again you're CC'd. And then I'm interested in the first part of Mr. Lang's response. Thanks, Jason. We are going to have a percentage of customers that do not contact despite our invitation, and these customers will have their debts raised regardless at the day 21 mark. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we go to the next email and chain at the top of the screen. It's from Mr. Ryman, dated the 6th of May 2015. It says, "Hey Owen, you are right in your assessment. One of the unknowns is how many will not contact and then how many will contact after being advised of the debt via letter. In round brackets, this is the reassessment stage, close round brackets. What we are thinking is that those who choose not contact are satisfied with the information in the letter and the process we will apply in calculating the debt." You see that?
Yes. Jason Ryman is the one responding in that email, and he worked for this witness. We'll hear from him next and go through this email in more detail. These were red flags even at this early stage. There could be so many reasons why someone doesn't contact Centrelink, like if they didn't receive the letters in the first place. So far, the evidence in this video might seem a bit all over the place, but it will start to come together. I'll end this witness's evidence with this snippet.
Now, this is, am I right, a proposed nomination for the Australia Day Achievement Awards for Mr. Ryman?
Correct.
For his role in shaping the strategic direction of the team that developed the online compliance intervention?
Correct.
So these were awards for, proposed awards for 2017 Australia Day?
Correct.
Which is in January?
Yes.
Do you know whether Mr. Ryman got that award?
I don't know specifically. I wasn't in DHS Services Australia at the time those awards were nominated. I don't recall receiving anything to say that he was successful in the nomination that I put forward.
Okay.
So let's now hear from Jason Ryman.
Mr. Ryman, would you please tell the Commission your full name?
Jason Peter Ryman.
Between 2011 and 2017, you were an executive level director in the Compliance Risk Branch of the Department of Human Services?
Yes.
And you reported to Mr. Scott Britton in that role, correct?
Yes.
You managed the Policy, Strategy and Business Solutions section of that branch?
Yes.
And one function delivered by this section was project management of projects that the branch undertook.
Yes.
Now, you mention in paragraph 30 of your statement that from early 2014, the branch, including you, started thinking about ways to modernise engagement with customers for compliance.
Yes.
And you mention a meeting you were invited to attend with Mr. Britton and Mr. Lumley in October 2014.
Yes.
To discuss potential budget measures for the 2015-16 budget.
Yes.
And do you recall what was discussed at that meeting?
I recall the discussion, and this, I'm reviewing my emails, was about looking at a way by which we could, the discussion was about the PAYG data and the number of cases that we had not undertaken any review on.
And that's in reference to what we discussed earlier, that ordinarily when discrepancies would be identified, there'd be an investigation by a compliance officer.
Ordinarily, but with the PAYG data, there was more cases or possible discrepancies than we were able to actually do any level of investigation.
What was the gap between the discrepancies that were investigated and were not investigated?
In terms of volume?
Yes.
Every year it varies, but it may be a couple of 100,000 possible anomalies that we would get, and we would do around 20,000.
Okay. And what was said about that data at this meeting?
I don't recall specifics.
You don't recall the specifics of what was discussed at the meeting?
No. I don't recall specifics. I recall from the review of my documents that there was actions that we commenced following the meeting.
What were those actions?
Starting to undertake further analysis of PAYG data, as well as some preliminary or some drafting of possible processes which look to use to start to look at, possible processes where we would have an online solution and we would ask the customer to go online and respond to the PAYG data anomaly.
And am I right that the process would then, if the customer didn't engage, calculate debt based on an assumption that a recipient of Social Security earned the same amount of income in each fortnight that was under consideration?
Yes.
And in effect, the total amounts of PAYG data would be averaged over those fortnights?
Yes.
And thereby involve the process of income averaging?
Yes.
Did you understand that assumption would have been untrue for a great many recipients of Social Security? That is, the assumption that the recipient earned the same amount of income in each fortnight under consideration?
Yes.
Did you understand that to make that assumption without further evidence would be to engage in speculation?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Did you understand that to make that assumption without further evidence would be to engage in speculation?
I'm not sure that's the right way to frame it.
Well, as you've said, as you've accepted, that the assumption would be untrue for a great many recipients of Social Security.
Yes.
So wouldn't you need to conclude that the assumption is true in respect of a particular recipient of Social Security to obtain further evidence? Do you accept that?
Sorry.
To conclude that assumption is true in respect of a particular recipient of Social Security, it would be necessary to obtain further evidence to corroborate it?
Yes.
Okay. And in the case that in that hypothetical scenario, without further evidence to corroborate the assumption, concluding the assumption is true would be engaging in speculation.
Yes, okay. Yep.
Thank you.
Well, if you accept and appreciated that this basis of assuming that you could legitimately, or that you could average PAYG data so as to reflect fortnightly income, if you accepted that that wasn't feasible, wasn't viable, how was this system allowed to be set up on that basis? What was your thinking?
The thinking was it was about using the best information we had at the time to make the determination.
Even if it was meaningless information, really, because it just wouldn't be true for a great number of recipients.
Wouldn't be true, it wouldn't be completely accurate.
Well, it wouldn't be any use at all for many because it just wouldn't have been the way they earned their income. I'm just trying to understand how it was rationalised. Somebody must have thought this is okay. Was it because you thought, oh, well, they can disagree with us if they want to? Or what's the thinking here? Can you remember?
The recollection of the thinking is really getting the customer to engage and to confirm their information and to provide information relevant to the query the query we're sending them about the anomaly. Yeah.
But you knew a lot of customers just didn't engage, didn't you? When they got a query from the department, particularly past customers, I would think.
I'm not sure we knew that precisely at that time.
All right.
Do you believe any advice that you obtained in the development of the online compliance intervention addressed the question of whether or not income averaging would be a lawful basis to calculate debts?
Not directly, no.
Now, you became project manager for the development of the online compliance intervention in July 2015, is that right?
Yeah, on or about, yes.
Appointed by Mr. Britton.
Yes.
And then there was a soft launch on the 1st of July 2016.
Of the online system, yes.
And that effectively involved testing the system with 1,000 customers?
Correct.
Okay.
Can I ask you about your 1,000 cases?
Yeah.
Was that designed just to bring up any technical hiccups in the system, or were you actually doing some sampling to see what proportion actually did recover in a debt which was objectively provable against other means, other sources?
I would say it's probably the more the technical.
Didn't you need to have some idea of how many of these discrepancies would actually result in a debt which could objectively be proved so that you would know what kind of proportion of actual misstatement you were getting over payments?
At the time, Commissioner, we believed that what we were doing was legal.
Legal, sorry, did
Yes.
you say? Yeah, but there's a difference between legality and knowing whether this thing actually works to establish overpayment. And it seems that to me that one way of doing it would be to get a sample of maybe 1,000, to see how many turn up as overpayments on debt averaging, and then go back to sources and work out how many of those were actually accurate, so you could see at least what proportion there were. But this, and tell me if this is fair, you just, you do your pilot, which is not really a pilot because it's not about online compliance, it's a manual process, and then you do your 1,000 cases to see if there's some technical hitches, and you haven't even finished that or got the results, and then it's, I think you say 90,000 cases initiated in September.
Yes.
All right.
This 1,000 customer soft launch raised technical issues, and the witness said that they argued internally that the system was not ready to be scaled up. The department went ahead anyway.
You refer to the opening sentence, the culture within the branch between late 2016 and April 2017. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you refer to some dealings with Mr. Golightly after the soft launch.
Yes.
And it says it was after the soft launch that a number of issues started to be raised from customers.
Yeah, so it was probably, later 2017 that we started to get a lot of issues being raised through various forums.
Okay, and that's after the system went fully live in September 2016?
Yes.
Okay. You state Miss Golightly would lose her temper and would shout at you and make personal comments about you.
Yes.
For what period would she engage in that sort of period by reference to when in late 2016 up to April 2017 would do you recall her acting like that?
It was probably from early-ish 2016-17, sorry, that Ms Golightly was very involved and would be demonstrating the behaviours that I've identified in my statement.
I just want to pause for a second, and we'll come back to this witness and his evidence in a minute. We keep hearing about someone called Malisa Golightly. She was a senior executive at the Department of Human Services and very involved in Robodebt. She died about a year ago. From her appearances at Senate estimates, when Robodebt was kicking off, it seemed like her responses were deliberately vague or misleading to cover things up.
Welcome. Malisa Golightly, Deputy Secretary, Department of Human Services.
Thank you. Welcome.
You piloted this system in July, August last year?
We did, Senator.
And what did that pilot tell you as to the risk of these kinds of failures that we've seen?
Senator, the pilot actually was very positive. It was around about 1,000 people involved, and basically it tested the system very well. There were a couple of ideas that came out of the pilot that have been progressively implemented over, I think, around about the September, October, November period, but they were on the margins. They were improvements to a couple of the screens and improvements to drop-down boxes, that sort of thing. So the pilot was actually very encouraging. The data matching part of the system has been automated for many years and is operating the same way that it's been operating for many years.
Before you started the process of sending this new process?
Yes, so the new process is putting part of the update and confirmation, the opportunity for the recipient to update or confirm the information online, giving them an online channel to do that. The bit that we do with the ATO has not changed since 1 July or before 1 July. It's the same. But that has always been the case, that the first step we take, if there's a difference identified between the two sets of data, the first step has always been that we contact the recipient and seek an explanation for what that difference might be.
And now what we're doing is, rather than ringing them, doing it online.
It's the A-Team, responsible for the largest class action lawsuit in Australia's history. At the same Senate appearance, there were others that will give evidence at the Royal Commission, including 2 later in this video.
Senator Kathryn Campbell, Secretary of the Department of Human Services.
Thank you. Senator Serena Wilson, Deputy Secretary, Department of Social Services.
Welcome.
Kath Halbert, Group Manager Payments Policy in Department of Social Services.
Welcome.
But for now, let's go back to Jason Ryman and continue with his testimony. Here he is giving evidence on one of the big issues with Robodebt, the fact that if someone didn't respond to an initial letter, a debt would be raised against them based on dodgy data.
I draw to your attention, Mr. Ryman, that's a chain of emails the 6th of May, addressed to yourself and others. It says, "Thanks, Jason. We are going to have a percentage of customers that do not contact despite our invitation, and these customers will have their debts raised regardless at the day 21 mark, I should say."
Mm-hmm.
See that?
Yes.
And now at the top of the page is your response to the 6th of May 2015. You say, "Hey, Owen, you are right in your assessment. One of the unknowns is how many will not contact, and then how many will contact after being advised of the debt via letter. What we are thinking is that those who choose not to contact are satisfied with the information in the letter, and the process we will apply in calculating the debt." See that?
Yes.
So firstly, can I confirm that you expected that there would be a percentage of customers
that would not respond to the initial letter identifying the discrepancy between the PAYG data and the DHS data, is that right?
Oh, I think I'm saying that we did not know how many would not contact.
Right. Well, Mr. Lang says we are going to have a percentage of customers that do not contact. And you respond, hey Owen, you are right in your assessment. You see that?
Yes.
So you did have an expectation that there would be a percentage that would not respond. Is that right?
I can't recall this specifically, but I understand what you're saying, yes.
Well, did you have an expectation that there would be a percentage of customers who would not respond to the initial letter identifying the purported discrepancy between the ATO and DHS data?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Did you have an expectation, as at 6 May 2015, so this is at the time it was going to be the second pilot, I think, that there would be a percentage of customers who would receive the initial letter identifying the discrepancy between the two sets of data and not contact in response?
Yes.
Okay. Did you have that expectation?
I wouldn't say it was an expectation. I think it was an outcome that was likely.
Okay. But there could be any number of reasons why the customer won't respond to the initial letter, wouldn't there?
Yes, there would.
Including, for example, they just didn't even get the letter.
True.
So how could you then proceed on the basis that all customers who didn't contact in response were satisfied with the information in the letter?
Sorry?
How could you proceed on the basis that all customers who did not contact were satisfied with the information in the letter?
How could we proceed on that basis?
Yeah.
I think this is something that we were looking to understand.
Well, it says what we are thinking is that those who choose not to contact are satisfied with the information in the letter. So how did you adopt that thinking?
That they'd be satisfied with the letter?
Yeah. Simply on the basis they don't contact in response.
Well, the letter itself was different to the previous letter that we sent for the PAYG reviews, where this letter included a lot more information about the data that we had from the Australian Taxation Office, including the name of the employer, the dates of employment, the amount of income. So at that time, had a view that customers may have looked at the information and be satisfied that, no, that's right, and proceed with that.
But there might be other explanations for why they would not contact, wouldn't there? Couldn't there?
Yes, there could be.
Including that they just didn't get the letter.
Yes.
So how do you then adopt the thinking that those who choose not to contact are satisfied with the information in the letter?
Well, this is saying those who choose not to contact. I don't think if you haven't received it, you haven't chosen not to contact.
Right. So how do you know who has chosen and who hasn't chosen?
We don't.
Right. Okay.
That was like pulling teeth, but it goes on.
Is this right, that this was a report in relation to the POIG pilot?
Yes.
Up to, detailing statistics up to that date, the 12th of June 2015?
That would be right, yes.
Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you see that it says, from the above graph, we can see that there is a total of 58% of customers who have not contacted within the prescribed period of time. The match data will be applied to the customer's record.
Yes.
See that? So that's of the customers who had been sent an initial letter in the course of the pilot. Is this right? 58% of them, up to the 12th of June 2015, did not contact the department in response.
Yes, that's what the report's saying, yes.
Can I put a cynical proposition to you? I'm not saying this is the position I take, but a cynical view of this might be that what you learn from that pilot would be that if you went ahead with this, you'd have something over half of customers who wouldn't give you any trouble, and you'd be able to raise a debt against them, and chances were you'd be able to recover it, and they would remain quiescent, that you would just have this passive market.
No, I don't think that was the outcome we were looking for. We certainly wanted customers to engage with us.
There's nothing in this process, though, that tested what proportion of customers weren't getting the mail or examined what responses were, why people weren't responding, was there in this pilot? Tell me if I'm wrong.
No, not in this pilot.
Okay.
Was there any investigations undertaken as to the reason why customers weren't responding at this rate?
I don't believe there was.
Right. Do you recognise this document as the pro forma standard initial letter that was used in the OCI program?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And you see under the heading important information about your employment income. Do you see that?
Yes.
It says we have received information from the Australian Taxation Office about your employment income. This shows that the amount reported to them is different to the amount you told us. To make sure you have been paid correctly, we need you to confirm your employment income information. Do you see that?
Yes.
It tells the recipient that they can, what they need to do, which is please check the enclosed employment income information or confirm the income online. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then gives a web address my.gov.au.
Yes.
Doesn't give a phone number. Do you see that?
Yes.
Can you tell us why a phone number wasn't included?
I recall the phone number wasn't included because we were really seeking customers to go online.
To minimise human involvement, effectively. No phone numbers in order to minimise compliance officer engagement.
I think probably more the intent was at the time really trying to move customers into an online environment as an agency.
You mentioned the reasons why the phone number wasn't included in this first iteration. Mm-hmm. Was that decision influenced by behavioural science?
I don't recall.
The project team drew on advice from experts in behavioural science, didn't they?
They did, yes.
And part of that advice was to design a process that would encourage people online, is that right?
It would have been part of it, yes.
Okay. But you don't have a specific recollection of whether the decision to not include the phone number had anything to do with that advice from behavioural science experts? Okay. It refers, as I've mentioned, to the enclosed employment income information, which is on the third page. We can go to that. And am I right that when these fields were populated in a particular recipient's letter, you would identify particular employers, the period for which the person was employed with that employer, mm-hmm. and their total earnings for that period. Is that right?
That's right.
It didn't identify specific fortnights?
No.
And am I right that at no stage this letter advised the customer that if the customer didn't engage, their income for each fortnight under consideration would be calculated by averaging that employer income information? Did it?
I don't believe it used that language, no.
Okay. So it could be the case, couldn't it, that a person would receive a letter like this and accurately indicate what they earn from particular employers during particular periods and decide not to contact the department because, as far as they were concerned, it was accurate, correct?
Yes.
but it gave them no warning at all that they were at risk of having their social security entitlements calculated using income averaging. Is that right?
Yes.
And in terms of the proportion of customers that didn't contact, as you identified through the pilot process, that could be one reason why they didn't contact, couldn't it?
It could be, yes.
Yep.
So somebody might look at that information and say, yes, that's what's on my group certificate, so I'm not arguing with it. But that would not necessarily be a concession that they earned the money at any particular time in the financial year. Isn't that so?
Yes, that's so, yes.
And then what would happen would be that their entitlements would be calculated using income averaging, correct?
Yes.
In circumstances where in a great many cases the result of that calculation would be inaccurate, correct?
The result would be yes.
Yes. And then a debt would be raised on the basis of that calculation.
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner, that's the evidence of this witness.
The entire next day was the questioning of the next witness, Serena Wilson. She's been mentioned a number of times previously, and this is now going back to the Department of Social Services.
Thank you, Commissioner. Can you tell the Commission your full name, please?
Serena Judith Wilson.
And you were formerly the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Social Services.
Yes.
Again, it's confusing that there are two similar sounding departments involved here, and even they don't seem to know exactly what each of their responsibilities are. But this is now on the side where they had the internal legal advice telling them that Robodebt was unlawful. A key question still is, why didn't anyone speak up throughout all the years of Robodebt operating? The questioning of this witness will deal with that. In the meantime, one part of the evidence was running through the reasons DSS was concerned about the Robodebt proposal in the first place.
Legal advice was unequivocal. Smoothing employment income over an extended period does not accord with social security legislation, which specifies that employment income is assessed fortnightly.
Yes.
You agree with that?
Yes.
And you've agreed earlier that the proposal as it was described in the 2014 email to you was the central theme of the Robodebt scheme.
Yes, it would appear so, yes.
Then we move to three further dot points which deal with policy matters. One is that the proposal is counter to the policy rationale for assessing employment income on a fortnightly basis to ensure that income support payments are made when income support recipients are most in need. You see that?
Yes.
That was a very strong factor weighing against the proposal, wasn't it?
Yes.
It was completely contrary to the policy which underpinned provision of income support supplements to those when they needed it at the time.
Yes.
Another reason why DSS did not support the proposal was that the information upon which the proposal was based was data matching with the ATO described as a very high level, and that it was unclear whether the proposed algorithm could accurately identify those who did not correctly declare income during periods when they received the support. You see that?
Yes.
That is a very significant evidential basis that weighs heavily against the Robodebt scheme, doesn't it? Or what was to become the Robodebt scheme.
Yes.
The question of review rights were raised, that they be likely, debts raised in this manner would be likely to be overturned by a tribunal based on current law. That was significant to you, wasn't it?
Yes.
Because what the proposal would result, or the result of the proposal in practical terms, was, following the shift of the onus onto a recipient, identified in that November email,
that there would be a likely backfiring of that result if there was a challenge in a tribunal.
Yes.
Again, it was identified the proposal was not clear on whether the customer would be advised that the debt was calculated on a smoothed amount and in what circumstances those calculations would likely have occurred, and that without that information, income support recipients could not effectively exercise review rights to ensure they weren't disadvantaged. Again, that was a significant policy aspect of the unfairness of the proposal, wasn't it?
Yes.
And there was a suggestion in the proposal which might have appeared to constrain or discourage review rights. What was described to you by Mr Whitecross was an alternative way forward, wasn't it?
Yes.
He identified the ATO Single Touch Payroll Initiative that would provide DHS with access to accurate real-time employment income details on a fortnightly basis. And there were lots of positives about that, weren't they?
Yes.
Those positives included calculation of debts in accordance with current legislation and policy intent. That's right?
Yes.
But your understanding at the time was that single touch payroll was some years away from full implementation.
Yes.
The opportunity to recover savings under the DH proposal would be lost if everyone waited until single touch payroll commenced.
Yes, the single touch payroll was prospective.
And so the only advantage from your position as Deputy Secretary of the Department of Social Services to the DHS proposal was short-term debt recovery, debt raising and recovery, but on every other level or from any other perspective, it was a really bad idea.
Yes.
When this witness is asked yes or no questions, it's usually okay. But as soon as she is asked more open-ended questions, she becomes very vague in her responses. It is very difficult to try and summarise her evidence because of this. Even the Commissioner has to pull her up on it, like in this next clip.
Might suggest that that was the case, but I'm finding it hard to understand quite what the behaviours, beliefs about role and purpose, and relationships between ministers and departments, both the Senior Social Services Minister, the Human Services Minister, the Secretary of the Department of Human Services, indicate about how this occurred. I'm finding it very difficult to understand.
You seem to be speaking in code almost. You're
I
saying that DHS were encroaching on DSS's jurisdiction.
That's how it looks in hindsight to me, Commissioner.
So let's get into the important stuff, starting with a meeting this witness had with Scott Morrison in 2015. At this point, she already knew that the legal and policy advice had said that Robodebt was unlawful.
Well, we've been provided with information which indicates that you and Mr Pratt met Minister Morrison on 22 January 2015. You had your clear policy answer to the proposal that was being discussed, and you had your clear legal answer to the proposal that was being discussed. Do you recall the meeting?
I don't recall the meeting. I believe... Sorry. I believe it was more likely to be, and this is reflection, I have no recollection of the meeting.
That was the extent of my question.
Yeah.
The issue of role responsibility was allowed, uncertainty about it was allowed to develop under your watch, wasn't it? Because instead of saying no to the proposal going to the Minister, you engaged with DHS about how it might be framed.
I guess we were trying to be collegial. We were trying to be clear about the risks and the issues, and we were. we appreciated that there were opportunities for digitisation, for different forms of service delivery, for scaling up the historical approach to data matching, all of which had some advantages, to risk profiling and selecting people for a review or an inquiry process. But I thought we'd killed it.
Did you say that to Minister Morrison on the 22nd of January?
No, because I don't recall what that meeting was about, but I believe that it was likely about a range of DSS proposals that were moving through the budget process that ultimately came into the 2015-16 budget, but I cannot recall.
Surely the clearest way to kill it was to commit the advice, both legal and policy, to writing and send it to your own minister.
In hindsight, I wish we had.
Well, in hindsight, there was nothing stopping you, was there?
I, at the time, had a genuine belief, and I thought some assurance from my colleague Ms Golightly, which was, and from other senior DHS officials.
Who were they? Please name them.
Sorry, you're asking about the 22nd of January?
Yes, the assurance you had that income smoothing would not form part of a budget.
No, I didn't have it at that point.
No. So you can't say that you thought you'd killed it, can you?
No, not on the 22nd of January, no.
No.
Serena Wilson then gave evidence that she thought the proposal would be changed so it wouldn't include income averaging, which was the unlawful component. The fact this didn't happen isn't a surprise, because there's no real record of the original legal advice being seriously considered. So the question then became, when did Serena Wilson find out that the proposal hadn't in fact changed and was using the process she knew was unlawful? The Commission is trying to figure out when she knew, to then figure out why she didn't say anything after that point.
When did you realise you were wrong about that?
It was after the measure was implemented some time.
Can you be more precise?
It would have been into the course of 2017, likely, and I really can't recall, it's a long time ago. Likely in the latter part of 2017.
We'll come back to the question of how you realised that. Did you at that point say, as a Deputy Secretary, this is unlawful and it is against policy and it needs to stop, to someone?
No, I didn't.
Why not?
I find it hard to explain now.
What's your best effort?
Lack of courage, as I reflect now. My attention, and this sounds shocking, was on a range of other priorities for government. Human Services were running and implementing the program, and it was difficult position to be in, and now I'm ashamed and, in hindsight, I could have spoken up. There had been no federal court case I had been assured immediately after the measure was implemented that income smoothing was not occurring.
By whom?
By Ms Golightly.
Was that the only person?
I can't recall who else was, but I had received an email in January 2017 where I was advised.
All right, well, we'll come back to that, but in any event, you say that courage or a lack thereof was one of the reasons why you didn't speak up in the latter part of 2017. Was there something you were fearful of?
My gut was telling me something was wrong. What was I?
Well, you had legal advice and policy advice.
Yes.
It was wrong. It wasn't a matter of intuition or guesswork, was it?
No.
No. All right. Was there something you were fearful of or troubled by when you refer to courage, a lack of courage? That is, was it your lack of courage related to an external factor or not?
My secretary had changed, and I had a different relationship.
Who was your secretary?
Miss Kathryn Campbell.
And were you fearful of her?
I had a different relationship with Miss Campbell than I'd had with Mr. Pratt.
Well, that's very vague, but you'll have to be specific. I understand what you're saying is that you didn't have the courage to raise the issue with Ms Campbell because of the nature of your relationship, and what were the characteristics of that relationship which made you feel that way?
It was a less warm and mutually respectful relationship. It was a different cultural experience. It was a more authoritarian environment. I found it a difficult period.
So difficult that you didn't at the time you realised that income smoothing was involved in the Robodebt scheme in late 2017, didn't say it?
I didn't have very good visibility of the extent to which it was occurring at that point.
So she knew in 2017 that an unlawful program had been implemented, and yet didn't say anything. She could have stopped this, and she felt she couldn't because she was busy with other things and because of Kathryn Campbell. She will give evidence later in the video. But ultimately, Serena Wilson's evidence came down to this exchange.
Coming back to the part of the answer you gave then, which you've given before, is that you were consumed or distracted by other priorities. Whether it be 15 January 2017 when the Ombudsman's report came out, or later in 2017 when you were aware that averaging was occurring throughout the ACI program and knew it was unlawful, the answer that you've given tends to suggest that you really just disregarded the consequences of that unlawfulness and were in your focus on other priorities.
I don't believe I disregarded the consequences of the unlawfulness.
You kept them in mind, but you didn't do anything about it.
I could have acted and I didn't. I was very concerned.
The point is you took no steps to do anything about a scheme that you knew was unlawful, irrespective of when you knew that.
It was a scheme that I was worried that it was unlawful. I was worried that there was averaging occurring.
Well, you knew it was unlawful and you knew that averaging was occurring. Don't wind back what you've already said a number of times. You had the opportunity to do something about it and you didn't take it, disregarding the consequences to those who were the subject of the unlawful scheme.
I could have acted and I didn't. I don't believe I would never disregard the consequences, which is why I believe ahead of it being designed and implemented, I tried to ensure that colleagues understood and accepted the advice that we'd given them and the concerns that we'd raised.
I'm not asking you about before the school was up and running. I'm not the slightest bit concerned with that in the parameters of my question.
Sure.
At the point that you knew it was unlawful and you knew averaging was being used, you did nothing, correct? You took no step to stop it.
I took no step to stop it.
You were in a position to do something about it as a Deputy Secretary of the relevant department.
Yes.
That means that you did that with actual knowledge of the consequences of the raising of unlawful debts on a large scale.
I took no action.
With that knowledge,
Yes, I think you're right.
when you were confronted, as you say, with the surprise on 15 January 2017 in the meeting in preparation for the meeting with the Ombudsman, you had a choice, didn't you? You could act consistently with the Code of Conduct, which applied to you as an Australian public servant, and give full and frank advice, or you could go down the road of doing things, taking steps, which ensured the continuation of what you then believed to be unlawful. That was your choice.
I could have done something then. I wish I had.
You were duty bound to.
I was duty bound to.
You were supposed to act with integrity,
Yes.
with honesty.
Yes.
You were supposed to give full and frank advice.
Yes.
You breached the code of conduct by your deliberate choice.
Yes.
The next day, we heard from the former Secretary of DSS and later DHS. A Secretary of a government department is essentially the CEO.
Yes, Mr. Gregory.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Pratt, could you tell the Commission your name, please?
Finn Axel Pratt.
Relevant for the scope of this inquiry, you have extensive experience with both the Department of Human Services in some respects, but also the Department of Social Services.
That's right.
The period that is of particular significance to the Commission is, as you understand, your role as Secretary of the Department of Social Services from September 2013 to September 2017.
Yep.
The witness's evidence makes it clear that around 2014 and 2015, there was a massive cost-saving pressure by the then coalition government.
You identify your priorities as Secretary during the period.
That's right.
The last of those is 18.11, supporting the then government's budget repair agenda. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, that was quite an enormous priority of the government in particular, and so obviously one of mine. But let me give you example because the two portfolios which were responsible probably for at least 50% of the expenditure of the Commonwealth, my department and the Health Department, were the biggest targets for finding savings in order to address the government's desire to reduce the deficit and to bring the budget into surplus.
Then there was evidence about notes from a meeting with Scott Morrison in early 2015.
Above it reads plus childcare integrity, welfare cop. I am now really casting back my memory, but I suspect that Minister Morrison was interested in having a welfare cop that operated across not only the social security system, but also the childcare program, because there were on occasion issues with childcare providers claiming things they shouldn't have.
I just pause you there. Do you recall subsequent media releases or announcements by Minister Morrison referring to a welfare cop on the beat?
The language is familiar, but no, I don't recall those media releases.
Here is Scott Morrison's media release, and an example of the reporting around that time.
What was your take on Justice Murphy's reference there to stuff up versus conspiracy?
Well, I read it in the last month, naturally preparing for this. I do remember the media report, and well, I thought his analysis with respect to His Honour was spot on.
Well, which was it then?
Commissioner, in my experience in the public service, it is almost always a stuff-up. I cannot think of any examples where a conspiracy has been concocted by people to do something deliberately.
Okay, what about conspiracy to conceal stuff up?
Sometimes bureaucracies can be pretty good at trying to minimise the damage from adverse reports in the media or in Senate estimates, that sort of thing. But ultimately, when it gets to Senate estimates, for example, then it is actually clearly a requirement for the bureaucracy to answer the question and to give the right information.
I don't agree with him. Senate estimates weren't able to get accurate information from the government, and government departments routinely don't answer the question or aren't straight in their answers. The next bit of evidence I want to go through is about the Commonwealth Ombudsman. This witness signed a letter to the Ombudsman during their initial investigation in 2017. In that letter, he said he was satisfied that Robodebt was in line with legislative requirements, or in other words, that it was lawful. So the question then becomes, how did he become satisfied of that fact, given the only legal advice they had was saying the exact opposite?
You were prepared to sign this letter which asserted that the department was satisfied the system is operating in line with legislative requirements, but you didn't ask to see any legal advice to that effect?
Commissioner, all of the advice I had seen over the preceding months was that my people had been dealing with DHS and that they were satisfied that the system was working as intended.
Well, this goes on to say there have been no changes in the way in which DHS assesses PAYG employment income. What did you actually ask? Did you ask, what are you doing? What is the DHS doing? What is this program? What does it consist of?
As I may have said earlier, I would have inevitably been talking with Ms Campbell at different stages. I have zero recollection of any suggestion that any one of us thought that the system wasn't working as it should be.
But did you ask how it worked?
No, I don't believe I did.
And you didn't say to your own department, to your own assistant, your own deputy secretary, did we get some legal advice on this? Could I have a look at it?
Commissioner, as I said earlier, my focus was in other areas. Yes, there was media on this, but please understand there was extensive, endless media on the NDIS, on the cashless debit card, on all sorts of things which DSS was responsible for. Now, obviously, that was wrong, and I was wrong in my assertion to the Ombudsman. I take responsibility for that.
For the balance of your time in the department, which is what, till about September 2017? You never were concerned about anything to do with Robodebt sufficiently to investigate actually what was going on or what advice the department might have had?
Commissioner, I was very heavily involved in things like the NDIS, right?
You've told us that.
Yes, I have told you that. The NDIS was all-consuming. All-consuming. There are so many different things in addition to that which were going on. I won't bore you with them. I was not focusing on a matter which was the creation of another department and which I assumed that they were managing as the best they could. It is not unusual for government programs, particularly ones based around savings measures, to attract an awful lot of negative media.
Your evidence in this inquiry, a number of things have happened which you've never heard of before. The first is that you were duped by a Deputy Secretary about the lawfulness of the scheme.
I don't accept that.
She gave evidence yesterday that she knew in 2017 that it was unlawful and didn't tell you. And you're describing positive representations by Kath Halbert at least, but maybe Serena Wilson, that it was lawful.
Mr. Gregory, if you are suggesting to me that there was some form of conspiracy amongst my people to dupe me, I refuse to believe that. I worked with these people for many, many years, and that is not the nature of these people.
So if you accept what I say to you, then, that Ms Wilson gave evidence yesterday that she knew it was unlawful in 2017 and did not tell you about it, even though she had an obligation to do so. And she knew that from the 15th of January 2017. Does your opinion change about whether you were duped or not?
I would have to see the context of that. I do not believe that that is possible. Early January 2017.
Yes.
Not
15 January 2017.
Well, I don't accept that.
You couldn't comprehend that that could be right, given your knowledge of her?
I just don't believe that is true. I cannot imagine why Ms Wilson would accede to that.
Perhaps because it was the truth. She had legal advice to that effect.
Why would she not tell me? I don't understand. What would be the motivation for not telling me?
He thought it was all good because he wasn't told otherwise, and had faith in his people. Yet he refused to believe that his people withheld information from him. The next witness was Kathryn Campbell.
Yes, Mr Gregory.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Your name is Kathryn Campbell?
It is.
If you've watched my Robodebt series, you would have seen her a few times. She appeared at Senate inquiries and consistently played down the seriousness of Robodebt and refused to accept the impact it had on victims. To me, it seems like nothing has changed.
You were appointed as the Secretary of DHS from March 2011.
That's correct.
And does it follow from your familiarity with the Department of Human Services in that role for that period of 6 years or so that you were very familiar with and had a good understanding of the raising of debts and recovery of debts in the pre-Robodebt period and during the Robodebt period?
I was aware of the raising of debts, but not a detailed knowledge of it. I was aware that that was a departmental responsibility, but there were some during that period between 35,000 and 40,000 people within the Department of Human Services, and so I would not say I was familiar on a daily basis with those activities.
Certainly, but you understood that, as you've said, it was a responsibility of the department to monitor where overpayments were made.
That's correct.
To recover those amounts where you could properly and lawfully do so.
That's correct.
And that undoubtedly occurred during the entirety of the period that you were the Secretary of the Department.
It did.
But you would agree with me that there was a change to the way that was done under the what's been described as the Robodebt scheme in the letters patent.
Yes.
And part of that change, or some of the essence of that change, I should say, is set out in a briefing to Minister Morrison from your department dated 12 February 2015.
Yes.
It was an executive minute drafted by Ms Golightly, who was your Deputy Secretary.
Yes.
And it undoubtedly went with your approval, even though you are not a signatory to it.
I had worked with Ms Golightly on the brief, yes.
And you were aware of the input of the Department of Social Services in respect to the draft?
I was.
And you were aware ultimately that the proposal in the form that it was given on 12 February 2015, if it was to be implemented as a budget measure, required legislative and policy change?
I think the brief indicated that DSS had indicated to us that there may be a need for legislative change, and we reflected that in the brief to Mr Morrison.
And there was no reason to take any change of view about the fact that DSS had said that it needed legislative change at any time prior to its implementation?
We had not, we had left that to the Department of Social Services with responsibility for the legislation. I had not subsequently seen the details that were finally agreed before by the government in the lead up to the budget.
The next day was when most of the questioning took place, and they continued to talk about the briefing that was provided to Scott Morrison from the department about the Robodebt proposal. The witness was being very evasive about some of the details.
Yes, maybe I'm not expressing myself clearly. You identify in dot point 3 the shift in obligation, and the shift involving the customer has to ensure the record is correct by providing evidence.
The brief so identifies that, yes.
And an additional change was that ATO data, that is the PAYG summary, would be used as the primary evidence rather than just a trigger, as it was under the manual system, correct?
Yes.
And I'm suggesting to you that the change in evidentiary weight that might be given to a PAYG summary in the debt creation process envisaged by this proposal was a significant change.
And my evidence was that it was a change, and it was envisaged that the recipient would still have the opportunity to provide alternate evidence.
But it was a matter for them in the context that the obligation had been transferred to the recipient.
And my evidence is that in the previous manual system, the compliance officer had also engaged with the recipient and provided them the opportunity to provide information as well.
Yes, but keep coming back to something that I don't think you are accepting now, which you previously accepted, that the first part of the change of the debt calculation process involved a transfer of an investigative or evidentiary obligation from Centrelink to a customer.
So this proposal did ask for the customer to provide information, yes.
It transferred the obligation to gather evidence to prove a claim from Centrelink to the customer.
Yes, and my only evidence that I was putting on the position was that in the past we had also asked customers to provide information.
It was interesting that the witness didn't want to accept that Robodebt had transferred the obligation to prove a debt onto the customer. Remember, before Robodebt, Centrelink would seek all the information it could, even from third parties, to prove a debt existed. With Robodebt, unreliable ATO information was provided to the customer in a letter, and if they didn't come back with the alternative evidence, a debt was created on that basis alone.
And the final dot point confirmed what had previously been flagged in the minute. There may need to be a change of policy to enable the use of ATO data in this way. DHS has also advised that legislative change would be needed to implement this initiative. As a result, we have been working with DSS on developing this proposal and will continue to do so.
They were talking about the briefing provided to Scott Morrison. The briefing clearly called out that legislation would need to be changed for Robodebt to go ahead. This was based on the 2014 DSS advice. But legislation never changed and the scheme was still implemented. So the questions that follow are trying to figure out whether the witness knew what was in the advice in the first place.
Are you saying that in your role as Secretary, you participated in the drafting of a minute to the Minister for Social Services without understanding the nature of the advice from DSS in respect of legislative change?
I was not responsible for providing advice to the Minister on legislative change.
I didn't ask you that. I asked you whether in drafting this minute, your participation in drafting this minute, you settled on a position described in this paragraph where you did not understand the relevance of legislative change to the proposal.
I understood that DSS had advised us that legislative change would be required.
So much is clear from the paragraph.
I had not, it was not my responsibility to draft or advise the Minister on that legislative change. This proposal had asked the Minister whether he wished to pursue this, and then it was envisaged that DHS would work with DSS. But DHS was not responsible for the legislative change. That was the responsibility of DSS.
I'm not talking about who's responsible for what. I'm talking about your understanding of what was meant by the advice that legislative change would be needed in the document that you participated in drafting. And as I understood your earlier answer, you didn't know what particular aspect of the proposal legislative change was needed for.
So in this brief, we did not articulate what the legislative change was. We articulated that DSS had advised that legislative change would be necessary.
Yes, you're still not answering my question. My question relates to your understanding of the advice. In what respect did you understand legislative change would be needed to implement this initiative?
I understood that DSS had advised that legislative change was necessary. I had not turned my mind to which parts of the legislation would need to be changed because I was not responsible for that legislation.
Again, I didn't ask you what part of the legislation needed to be changed. I asked you what part of the advice about the need for legislative change related to whatever aspect of this proposal.
I cannot recall that I drilled into what parts of the legislation needed to be changed.
It didn't take...
Did this affect your department? The fact that the legislation under which you operated had to be changed? Wouldn't it be something you'd want to know about?
Commissioner, the split between DHS and DSS at that time was that DSS was responsible for the legislation and DHS...
Look, I think you're saying the same things you said to Mr Gregory. They draw it, but it would affect your department, surely?
It would affect our department, but...
So didn't you need to know what it would do, how it would affect your department?
We were administering many programs for many policy departments with many pieces of legislation. And it was our practice and the administrative arrangements orders that those departments were responsible for those pieces of legislation.
So what were you going to do, sit back and see what changed and worry about it then? Or would it not affect your day-to-day functioning if there were a change in the legislation under which you were operating?
It did on many, many programs, but we didn't provide advice on the actual legislative change.
Okay, we've established that. It's the lack of curiosity about what that legislative change might entail in circumstances where it would unquestionably affect the operations of your department. How do you account for that?
In hindsight, it looks like a lack of curiosity, but I note that at that time we were relying on the policy departments to provide the legislative advice.
But you don't know what the legislative advice was. You didn't ask what would change.
No, I didn't, because at this point in time we were asking for agreement to pursue these issues, and this was a pretty preliminary piece of advice asking whether we should continue to move through this, and I had envisaged that the Department of Social Services would work through those legislative change items.
Well, no doubt Mr Gregory will go on to establish how you did the working through. Mr Gregory?
Yes. You said you didn't drill down into what the legislative change was and to how it related to various aspects of the proposal set out above.
No.
But it wouldn't have taken any drilling down, wouldn't it? You could have just said to Ms Golightly, have you got a copy of that advice that I can have a look at? Should we attach it to this minute?
The legislative change or...
The SS advice.
We could have. It was probably an email of the type. We could have added it to the advice. But at this stage, it was quite preliminary. We were asking the Minister, did he want us to pursue it? I would have envisaged that more detail would have been done as part of the policy proposal.
You didn't need to drill down on it. You could have asked Ms Golightly for a copy of the advice. That's all you had to do.
I could have, but we accurately reflected in the brief that DSS had advised that change would be necessary.
Accurately have reflected that a change would be necessary in what respect of the proposal?
The brief does not articulate which particular part of the legislation, and I do not recall.
It could be all of it, couldn't it?
It could be all.
Basically, they drafted the briefing without knowing what the actual advice was. There were also questions about why DHS didn't get its own legal advice.
Why is it that when you considered the question of whether DHS should obtain legal advice in respect of the lawfulness or otherwise of its implementation of the program in early 2017, that you decided not to?
So, under the legal services directions, we have what's called an administering entity, which is in this case, under the Social Security Act, was DSS. Because DSS was getting legal advice, we generally try not to be having competing legal advice, so we would therefore rely on the DSS advice.
But the first you became aware of the DSS advice was when it turned up in response to the Ombudsman's inquiry.
I think there had been discussions throughout January, and I don't have any record of those, and I have searched for a record of that to determine whether I was, when I first became aware, I do recall asking at the time, hey, we thought this needed legislation, did we get legislation? If we didn't get legislation, why not?
But it would have been of crucial importance to you as the administering entity with legal responsibility in respect of the lawfulness of the scheme to have your own position on it.
So that's not how legal advice works always in the Commonwealth. So the legal services directions is very clear that if I was to seek legal advice as the Secretary of Department of Human Services, I would need first to go to the DSS, who was the administering entity, predominantly to find out whether there are many reasons why these legal services directions exist, but one of them is to ensure that we're not continually getting legal advice on the same matter. In this example, if DHS had wanted to seek legal advice on DSS legislation, they would need to go to DSS first.
Why didn't you do that?
I can't answer that.
Well, you must have an answer of some form. You considered it not necessary, obviously.
Well, I don't think I said that. I said...
Well, what possible explanation could there be?
So secretaries don't always commission legal advice themselves. This was a very large department, and so there was no possibility that I could understand or be seeking advice on every element of the Department of Human Services. So when the issue became media attention and we identified that there was a problem in January of 2017, I think that is when I would have discussed it. But I don't recall the dates or the content of those discussions with Ms Golightly and Ms Mussolino.
And what you're saying is you can't now give an explanation for why you decided not to seek your own legal advice or to ask DSS to obtain the legal advice.
No, I can't.
The witness claimed that they didn't get legal advice because the process would have been for DHS to contact DSS first to check if they had advice. This was apparently to avoid double-ups. Yet, she then admitted that she didn't even check with DSS in the first place. To me, this is all just an attempt to avoid taking any responsibility by giving really vague answers. But the senior counsel assisting is just too good for it, and catches it out each time. Like in this next clip, where she says that she didn't turn her mind to the legality of Robodebt because elements were in place for a long time pre-Robodebt.
There were many elements within DHS that I didn't I don't think I turned my mind to the legality of, because they had been in place for many years.
Right. Mr Gregory?
Yes, it was clear though this was a change to what had been in place for many years.
This was a change.
And you still didn't turn your mind to the legality of it.
I didn't ask for legal advice.
Is that a yes?
Didn't turn my mind. It is, yes, I did not turn my mind to it. At the time of 2015, in 2017, I did turn my mind to it, and I was privy to legal advice from the Department of Social Services.
So how does this sort of situation get resolved then? If things are failing on at many points of the program and things are being done illegally, how does it ever get overseen and prevented if the secretary's always too busy to attend to it, and the deputy secretaries presumably don't do it properly? It's just all too bad. What's the solution?
So the solution, I think, is that when an issue arises, that a matter is reviewed. This matter wasn't reviewed in hindsight. We should have got external legal advice.
Well, it's a pretty easy thing to do, isn't it?
To get
day one?
To get external legal advice. I consider that there was a gap between DHS and DSS and a lack of clarity on who was seeking the legal advice. And in 2020, when I was the Secretary of DSS and the CEO of Services Australia, we commissioned a review of how legal advice was dealt with between the two entities, because one of the learnings from this is, I think, that we were not clear on who was responsible for getting the legal advice when a matter arose.
But if you say there was a lack of clarity about who was getting legal advice, it's simply because you didn't ask, isn't it? Didn't ask the question of who's doing what and what's the legal advice you've got.
I didn't ask, but I had an expectation, and that proved not to be the case.
Well, it's a pretty foolish expectation if you have no actual factual basis to support it.
Kathryn Campbell's evidence then concludes with this exchange, which I think caps it off really well.
Well, would you describe the Robodebt scheme implemented under your secretaryship as a massive failure of public administration?
I consider it was a failure of public administration.
On a massive scale?
On a massive scale, on a significant scale.
Can you think of a larger scale failure?
In recent times, I think it is a significant matter. I have been involved with other significant failures. I have been aware of other significant failures, and there have been other significant failures, but I don't think that it's useful to talk about those.
It's 1 o'clock.
Yes, I'm afraid we're going to have to adjourn your evidence to, I think it's the 5th of December, Ms Campbell?
Yes.
So we will need you back on that day, the 5th of December.
There's a complete inability to take responsibility. She had plenty of opportunity over the years to get advice. There was media attention, 2 Senate inquiries, tribunal decisions saying it was unlawful, and eventually federal court challenges. But instead, she kept defending the scheme and allowed it to continue. Anyway, that was her evidence for the time being, but she returned in December to give further evidence, so we will see more of her in future videos.
Thank you, Commissioner. The next 3 witnesses are Ms Bolton, Ms Boyle and Ms Eagle, who will each give evidence as part of a panel for this afternoon's session, and I think they are in a position to either be affirmed or take an oath.
All right, would you proceed? Thanks.
Ms Bolton, if I might start with you, can you tell the Commission your name and the role in which you give evidence here this afternoon?
Genevieve Bolton, I'm the Chair of Economic Justice Australia.
And Ms Boyle?
My name is Kathryn Boyle and I'm the Executive Director of the Welfare Rights Centre.
Right. And Ms Eagle?
Yes,
Yes, my name's Kathryn Eagle and I'm the Principal Solicitor at Welfare Rights and Advocacy Service in Western Australia.
These witnesses gave evidence about what community legal centres were seeing throughout the Robodebt period.
Ms Bolton, we've just heard some frontline first-hand experiences of how robo-debts were dealt with by community legal centres. How did EJA respond when it first became aware?
Well, we sought a meeting with the Department of Human Services, because member centres were sort of scrambling as we were to understand the changes in the system. So that meeting happened in early January 2017, the 9th of January. At that meeting, we raised our concerns in relation to the averaging process. We also raised concerns in relation to the automatic application of the 10% penalty fee. But by and large, the purpose of the meeting was to obtain a briefing from the department in terms of the changes to the system, and also to look and also to get more detailed information in relation to the workings of the portal itself.
Do I understand from that answer that prior to the introduction of the Robodebt scheme, there was no great advance warning in the general consultative process that EJA had on an existing basis with the department?
That's my understanding, yes.
In January 2017, the Commission is aware that the Ombudsman became interested as well as a result of complaints there. Did EJA have any interaction with the Ombudsman's inquiry?
Yes, we did. So we wrote to the Commonwealth Ombudsman by email, the then Executive Officer, on the 21st of December 2016.
And you've attached that email to...
And that email is attached to my supplementary submission.
It's telling that these advocacy groups were raising the issues during the Ombudsman's investigation, and yet nothing happened.
You'd made the Ombudsman your first port of call, I think, in trying to take up that question of legality. What were you hoping for, and why did you go to the Ombudsman?
Well, we were hoping for that there would be some recommendations which were made in relation to the identifying the unlawful aspects to the scheme.
And what sort of impact did it make when that was just not touched on, really?
Well, it was really disappointing.
Did it make any difference to your advocacy from then on, or how effective your advocacy could be, or did you just put it to one side?
Well, I formed the view at that point that really what needed to happen was that it needed to be tested in court, because we had consistently raised our concerns in relation to aspects of the scheme which we believed to be unlawful, and that consistently fell on deaf ears.
Mm-hmm. This was just the first set of deaf ears?
Yes.
I fully agree with the evidence given, and I suppose the only two things that I would add to that, and one arises out of that discussion, which is about the role of the Ombudsman. I think it highlighted for us that with individual complaints that people were making, they weren't seeming to get their issues resolved, and the reports we would get back was it was a waste of time, so that was disappointing.
I guess something I would like to add is that very early on in the piece, we went public with our views about the difficulties with Robodebt. So this was in March 2017. One of our solicitors was interviewed for background briefing on ABC, and really made some very, because we were still trying to figure out what was going on, but they really kind of nailed it at the time, and I wish that what they said was heard. So they said things like that the debts were completely impossible to understand, that debts need to be properly calculated, that it's unfair to put responsibility back onto the Centrelink customer, that data match, importantly, is a basis for a suspicion of a debt, not the basis for calculating a debt, and that Centrelink has the power to check this information for themselves. It's frustrating that it still went on for years after that, even though it was, we were trying to raise the alarm over it.
Ultimately, these community legal centres were barely resourced to help vulnerable people, let alone when Robodebt caused a massive spike in people needing assistance. Even then, they tried to blow the whistle early, but no one listened. And that's my key takeaways from week 2. If you're still around, then I hope you enjoyed it. I plan to do a recap of every week of evidence for the entire Royal Commission. It will take me some time to get through it all, and I'll have other content in between episodes. This stuff takes a lot of effort, and if you want to support the channel grow, then please check out my Patreon page, link is in the description. And I'll see you at the next one.